This is Dave Monk, Prairie Monk, WAFT, Champaign, 90.1 on your FM dial.
And I feel just a little bit like the building across the street, coming apart little by little. They're working on the building that's apparently going to turn into one of the new establishments across the street. Where are my manners? So I'm Dave on the board, and this is the Prairie Monk program, where you'll hear for 1 hour stuff about rails, trails, and greenways, and ecology, and anything else that has been going on for the last week. Today is Sunday, April the 29th, 2018.
You mentioned the building across the way. What they're doing right now is removing the gravel. Often on a flat roof, especially, you put it in gravel. It sort of distributes the heat, and so that they've decided to put in a different roofing, and the gravel is coming off into a trash can. And it's creating quite a lot of dust, even half a mile away. So it's, I wonder sometimes if there couldn't be some sort of channel that you put your material into so that it falls into the dustbin without a lot of dust.
One advantage of bicycling, car drivers don't seem to understand, we're threatening the poor bicyclists. They don't know that we're here. Trust us, we knew you were here long before you knew that we were there. We can see in all directions, hear in all directions. With what they're doing across the street, I can smell the very potent stuff that they were using, I guess, as an adhesive. It's the stuff that you use on poles for electricity and power. What's that guck called that has that really rancid smell? It was also in the train tracks too, and the reason they had to dig down so far to get rid of the
creosote.
Creosote, thank you.
Yes.
You can smell it coming off that building from across University from it.
Yeah. So, okay, we have some announcements. The Upper Sangamon River has a work day on the 5th. I'm not quite sure where you accumulate, but get hold of the Upper Sangamon Valley people through the Forest Preserve. There's a ride to work thing on May the 1st, so think about riding to work. Grand Prairie Friends has a plant sale coming up on Saturday, next Saturday, and get there early. It's from 8 till 1, and the best plants are there early, so go have a look-see. It's a rather wonderful sale. The Forest Preserve has a Prairie Museum, and its 50th anniversary is coming up on Friday the 4th at 6 p.m. Call 586-32. I've got four numbers here. I've got the wrong. Call the Forest Preserve to find out about that celebration. It goes back to Mr. Galvin, who put it together, decided there should be a forest preserve, went to Europe and looked at things happening there, came back and did things like the Mahomet Forest Preserve, and then later that got to be extended to other parts of the county. There's a rain barrel sale on Saturday the 5th, 10 to 1, in a banner, and that's about my notifications at the moment, but they're all interesting things that are happening, and you can be involved. The rain barrels help you have little rain gardens that you can water when there's no rain. Remember that traditionally the rain pattern is wet spring, wet fall, and dry summer. So it's in the summer that you need the rain barrel storage. And you have to protect it from mosquitoes and frogs so that you don't have that sort of pollution. This is coming off the roof. I'm onto solar panels today. The Champaign County Zoning Board of Appeals was hearing appeals about the rules of the game for putting in solar panels. They've had 5 requests so far for solar panel farms. They can be some more small ones, 5 or 10 acres, that will allow you to run your own farm or industry. It probably doesn't go into a grid, it's used directly. But in Sydney, they have had a request for a big farm. I think it's 1,000 acres or more, and that involves a lot of details. So there were at the County Zoning Board of Appeals on Thursday night, I think it was, various people were prepared to speak to this, and generally speaking, the impact on the environment is fairly low. The main concern is noise, and the noise is fairly minimal. It involves converters or inverters that take DC current to AC current, and there's a little bit of noise involved. But from a point of view of noise, magnetism, water, odors, glare, heat, aesthetics, property values, drainage, roadways, and agronomic reuse, there's not a great deal of impact. This is not like putting in wind vanes that require quite a lot of concrete and road access. So there is also some cost comparisons with solar and wind. Both have their problems. The solar doesn't operate at night, and wind doesn't operate when there's no wind or when there's too much wind. So there is the perpetual question of taking agronomic land out of action. Could that land be producing food or producing seed for animals or for humans or ethanol? So there's a tradition of agriculture that we have to consider there. I'm going to look at my notes some, just in case I forget to.
While you do that, I just, in fact, read an article about a farmer, a potential farmer out west, who, along with his wife, decided we're not going to use this land for farming anymore. We're going to make it as it's going to hold like a sponge as much carbon as possible. And it turns out if you don't put manure, but put compost on the ground and rotate it through with cattle, you'll get an interesting combination of plants that will come up. You'll get deep-rooted plants that will be able to hold on for a very long time to carbon. And they say that, was it per acre, per some number of acres, it could hold as much carbon as a car would produce driving from Miami to Seattle. So get enough. It didn't take very many acres to absorb that much carbon. So talking about if you could take it back out, and if you have something with shallow roots, like for example crops, you're not going to be able to hold nearly as much carbon.
That's interesting, and that debate goes on beyond any specific zoning for a county or for individual sites like Sydney. So some of this is large scale, and it has an income differential. The farmland rental at the moment is running around $250 an acre. but some of the rental for solar panels is like 800 an acre. So there's a considerable difference. So if you're looking at economics, then there's a reason for attracting solar panels. There's also the interest in perhaps even creating tax breaks to encourage such activities. Licensing and sustainability is a big question here. What do you license? Who do you license? How do you license? It's a big question. So you look at various aspects of this, and this was the general debate of the County Zoning Board of Appeals. So this is not the be-all and end-all of everything at the moment. This is debate to see what we can do, and the public is really invited to be a part of this. Often at this stage, when you don't have much state or federal rules of the game to go by, it's a matter of talking to each other. And over, the conservation groups that involved with this sort of debate say, please talk. Talk is somewhat different from making a black and white statement that cannot be changed. Talk often is loose. You may change your mind in the middle of your debate. It's valuable to talk. Frank DeNoble was speaking to this point and saying it's very healthy for people to say what they feel. Often they're feeling the same in different ways, so it would appear to be in conflict, but are not. And sometimes it's technology that needs to be followed. For instance, noise is of a major concern. And there's a need for people who will creep around with sound devices to record what the snore of a dog is, or the road traffic outside, or the birds, or what is an inverter going to do when it converts from DC current to AC current. It's sort of a murmur, and is a murmur a more dangerous thing for your brain than one hit on an anvil once in a while? So there's these sorts of debates, and then there is research on these things. So that's the role of the Regional Planning Office, is to look at this sort of debate and to ask other counties what they have found out already, and it's like building your case on cases that are already established in Kankakee County, LaSalle County, or Effingham, or wherever, at a federal level. There's an technology to be concerned. You have there's two ways of producing the electricity. One is photovoltaic. You're taking that piece of solar panel, and it has in its chemistry the ability to produce electricity. So that's photovoltaic. Another form of doing it is to have a fluid, might be water, might be something else, but the sun heats the fluid, and then the fluid is converted into energy. We're mainly concerned with the photovoltaic. It's somewhat more common in the West to do the heat thing, and sometimes the heat is not put into electricity, it's put into a stoneware, and the heat is used later in the day to heat the house. So that's a different cat. So looking at the technology is important. The panels are supported with an array that faces the sun, and in some cases that can be moved so that it adjusts to where the sun is. That's fairly sophisticated. Most of the requests, or most of what happens in Illinois, has been without that sort of movement. More to the west, perhaps, they do that movement and have that technology. There's an escrow accounting for this. There's a question of how long are these panels going to be there. As they're used, they probably will destruct or wear out, so they won't be as efficient in 5 years' time. So there's a repair necessity. There's a functional obsolescence. Will this technology be in existence in 10 years' time? So what do we do with the material that's left? Is there a way of recycling it? Well, the question is, no, it's got heavy metals and other things in the chemistry, and so theoretically you have to recycle this in a known place like Kansas, where there's a survey and you know exactly where your hazardous waste is being placed. So that puts the cost of this up. So if somebody goes bankrupt and moved out of the panel farm, then there needs to be an escrow account to say that there will be some recyclability of the materials. So that's a matter of debate, how much you're going to charge for escrow, a promise to deal with the waste. There's a taxation and abatement. If you are in the county and it's a flat county and you think that you can do these sorts of farming things, you may want to encourage this. And that usually goes with a tax abatement, so that certain construction costs are abated, or taxation permanently is less. So there's a question of what will the tax be. Is this in a rural setting? So is a rural setting, is that going to be taxed by farmland prices, or is it going to be an industrial tax? You have to think about these things. There are some details, and these come up regularly. So how far apart are your panels going? There's rows of panels. You have to know that there's these sloping panels that are probably 5 feet by 6 feet, and they're facing the sun. But they're up off the ground so they don't get into trouble with drainage or other things like that. But they grow weeds. So how do you handle the spacing? Do you mow? Do you herbicide? Do you have a goat? Do you have a sheep? Do you plant prairie? Do you plant pollinators? What do you do with this space between the rows of panels? If you have a goat, you're going to have the goat up on the panels, and that's not really an ideal thought, but you have to think about these things. So panel spacing, panel height. How high is as an aesthetic? Are you going to see ugly panels? Well, the height seems to be limited to be about 8 feet. And also, as fencing, you're going to have electricity floating around, and so you need an 8-foot chain link fence around the place. So there's rules about that. So there's sound is a major problem, and so there's people that want to say that anything above 35, 40 decibels is going to affect your hearing, but then sound falls off fairly quickly. So is that on top of the inverter, or is it 30 feet away or 100 feet away? And it would seem that the sound is fairly minor, but there's that sort of debate as to whether it's going to affect my sound. Some people have moved to Sydney from places where there were wind mills, and they are not pleased that they've moved away from those windmills that do have a sound. You can hear them zoom, 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 zoom. That blade is moving, and if you're sitting on the outside end of it, it's going 72 miles an hour, and it makes a sound, and it also manages to kill birds, and so so people that have moved away from that to an area where they think there's not going to be a problem would not like to hear noise coming from inverters. So you can landscape, you can put trees around, and that will drop the sound, and also eliminate some of the aesthetic concerns. We have other models. Other counties have been doing this already. Kankakee, LaSalle County, Shelbyville. U of I has 6 acres, and it's the zoning board of appeals and those sort of places have gone through their homework, and so they can be visited and they can have pictures and help explain. Some of the technology is fairly helpfully explained by these other counties. If you want an array, for instance, you have an aerial photograph or technical diagram of the array. So you have the panels themselves lined up in a field. You can look at it from the air. And then you have a inverter, and then you have a transformer, and then you have a lot of wiring to take this power out to a grid. And so that's a simple diagram, but it helps people to understand where the costs are and what are the benefits of doing that. If you're little, you can take your power and use it yourselves in an industry or whatever. But if you're bigger, you are dependent on substations and interacting with the grid. And some grids are old, and so if you're going to poke extra power into the old power lines, then sometimes they will heat up, and that means they bend down and they may short onto trees. So you have to worry about the grids that we don't have. There are state and federal guidelines, but they've been worked over too. So this is one of those things where you're looking at the initial stages and putting together the rules. It's a little bit like Facebook. You are faced with changes that nobody's quite sure what the end point is, and there needs to be some control, and debate actually helps a great deal. So now, let me look at the time.
45 minutes.
Okay. I've been talking to the Forest Preserve this week. I'm still very anxious to see that the next phase of the Kickapoo Trail is not as wide, and that it will preserve some of the original soil and some of the bacteria and fungi and remnant prairie plants that's in that space. When you're down to 0.01% of the remnant prairie that the state has preserved, you really need to preserve that genetic gene pool. And it's not just a problem for us in one situation on the Kickapoo Trail. It's more than that. It's if, for instance, if you're dealing with the portion of the Kickapoo Trail that's in the Champaign County area, then you're dealing with a forest preserve, which is basically the owner of this corridor. But that prairie continues through to Oakwood and on to Danville. And it's the only place where we often have an opportunity to pick prairie seed. Doris Westville in Danville picked most of her seed off of a railroad remnant prairie, which if we continue to go through the width of the trail that's between Urbana and Danville, will exterminate that sort of gene pool. So that's Vermilion County. So how do you talk to Vermilion County? There are two different organizations. One's a forest preserve, which has a slightly more orientation to recreation and well health, and the Vermilion County is a conservation district which has more authority to be concerned with the remnant alongside. Those are two different organizations which were put into action because people like George Fell felt that that was needed, and the conservation area brings a little more toward the conservation end. But then we have to think about the whole area. And so one of the things I was talking to the Forest Preserve about was that we're looking at a 30-mile trail, perhaps, between Bloomington and Mansfield. Eventually we'd hope that that would connect up with Champaign. But we're talking about McLean and a different county. And how do we get 10 counties together? Like at the moment, we're losing a area between Paris and Heavey City, which is an abandoned rail trail, which was in the or abandoned railroad, Penn Central Railroad. The Department of Natural Resources bought partially for a trail, but also it's loaded with prairie, but that's going to go back to farmers for a few more rows of agriculture. So that's of concern. So we're looking at perhaps 8 or 10 counties in east central Illinois. We're looking at Grand Prairie Friends is in Coles County with 400 acres of forest, and with prairie at places like Loda. So once you're in Loda, you're in Ford County. And traditionally, all these counties have their own jurisdiction and their own voting behavior, and they don't like to go outside of that voting behavior, and they don't like to tell people what to do with their land. That's been the problem with the landfill at Clinton. Do other counties tell Clinton what to do with its landfill on top of a aquifer from which 80,000 people drink? So you have there a policy now of not including PVCs that are a type of plastic that leaches into the environment, and so there was an attempt to raise money by inviting 5 states to put their PVCs into that sort of area. So it was dramatic enough that you then start to get regional planning beyond the one county. How do we do that? Well, there's a very good example in Chicago, put together by a guy named Gunnar Peterson many years ago. It's an advisory body. It doesn't tell anyone what to do, but it does a lot of research to aid the sort of debate that we were talking about with solar panels. It employs environmental lawyers, land planners, and they are asked by various counties to provide information. Well, that's happening locally here. We get the regional planning office, which is really regional planning for Champaign County, but it gets contracted to do planning for bicycleways. So they get involved with that, and they work with engineers, the Farnsworth Group, to do plans for specific cities or towns. But one of the problems is the connectivity. How do you ride a bicycle between Danville and Decatur? How do you, for instance, get through Champaign City without being run over by a truck? We also have to think about waterways. For instance, Danville has had a problem with small dams that actually change the ecology of the waterway, and they tend to create a small dam, and people get into that with a canoe and don't even realize that at the end of it there's a small waterfall, and you can go over the end with your canoe and you can die. So there's been a tendency in recent years to take out those sorts of dams. And here you have debate with community people have been involved with some of this sort of thing, where people from Champaign are using counties that are around them, because Champaign is fairly flat, used to be very swampy, and it doesn't have the terrain that you get in Danville or Vermilion County or DeWitt County or Piatt County. DeWitt County has the Clinton Power Plant Lake and Weldon Springs State Park, and Piatt County has Allerton Park and Lodge Park and Shady Rest and the Railroad Museum. So how do we bring all these people together? There's been about 10 different attempts to bring all the nature people together, but it never really works. You really need an office, you need a CEO, and you need a board that is comprised of a range of different interests. And you need leadership, you need training, you need people who are doing degrees in planning and nature and nurture, and they need to be developed as leaders in this particular field. So we need a structure for East Central Illinois Regional Planning Office. It might go further than that. or we might even have a downstate planning office. And what happens with the Open Lands Project, for instance, in Chicago, is that it attracts responsibility. This is an organization that is recognized as doing interesting work to work on the questions that are asked by the public, and to develop the details, to not be demanding, but to be providing information. And often those people sit on boards that where they're very helpful, or they're brought in as advisors. And often you'll see at the bottom of a list of board members a list of advisors who can be brought in for a specific question about water or air or railroad lines or whatever. And gradually that sort of organizations develops a responsibility for various aspects of what they do. They may not cover everything. It might be that some states are better doing something with, like the library in Urbana conserves a lot of county information. There's another one that's like it in Indiana that does something like that. But not all libraries do that. So you have to figure out what is it that you might want to do. If we're going to look at the 30 miles between Bloomington and Mansfield, do we do something that's as unusual as leaving some of the rail that's intact so that we could have blind people use a corridor? Could you have a track that could allow off-road vehicles to run on the railroad lines? There was an era when young folk would take a 56 Chevy and let the tires down and run on the rails. Now, this same people will go to the west where there are vacant lines where they can do that, and they can run the rails and have fun doing that. They can put bicycles on the rails. They can put pumper trucks on the rails. So you have to think of alternatives. We have to know that in the case of part of the Bloomington Trail is running parallel to a road, and if population goes up, then the road may be widened. And guess where it'll be widened? It'll be widened out of the remnant prairie that's next door. So how do we look at counties that might have not as much money as another county, cities that have resources? We have had a Pepsin factory in Monticello, for instance, that was an arch icon of economic development. But the factory didn't look so good, and it can always be spoken down to. It's easy to criticize a site. It's harder to preserve a site. So that factory has gone, but now it's a vacant lawn, and it's remembered because State Street was a state street for millionaires who were taking this Pepsin and sending it around the world, and the railroad beds were designed to do that. So it's a little bit like Allerton Park, where the Army Corps of Engineers was about to dam the park for a water retention that would allow tourism and a different sort of tourism than Allerton Park provides. So you have to deal with the Army Corps of Engineers and the federal and state governments and local concerns, because when you're in a flat area like East Central Illinois, if you raise a dam 2 inches, then you collect water for 2 miles. It's one of those things where several counties were involved. How do you challenge that? How do we encourage artists to interpret what we're talking about? If you go to downtown Champaign, there's a wonderful sculpted piece that tells us what an aquifer looks like. So children have been involved, and this sculpted piece runs around a big room. It's comprised of bottles, plastic bottles to represent the water, the cardboard to represent the soil and the geology, but it helps to let people know what we have and what we don't have. This week, we're concerned with a little pocket prairie across the way. And David has already mentioned the building has been taken over, and the prairie will be taken over as a place where you can drink a beer and watch the traffic on University Avenue on the railroad line. And so what do we do with that? And a number of people have gotten into looking at that. Could some few of the very deep-rooted plants remain and be attractive? One of the values of that pocket prairie is that it's a niche, and it's nature, and it attracts a lot of people. And so we need artists, and so I went looking for a WEF review, and in that WEF review there's a drawing of the pocket prairie by Sandra Outen, and so we need to talk. Perhaps could this be a bar that's a prairie bar? Could it be is the name Prairie too well used? Are you likely to get into legal conflicts using that sort of thing? But just as a prairie, because you have prairie gravel companies, prairie laundromats, prairie, all sorts of things. How could you name and use that pocket prairie as an encouragement for people to come and enjoy it? And so we've been talking to the owners of the license to put the 3 bars into action, and it's been very pleasing to actually for people other than someone like myself who's pretty interested to pick up and figure what we might be able to do. So this Thursday we had Leslie Mitchell from the city, and Eleanor Blackman, who is the engineer in charge of the Big Dig. And we not only looked at the little prairie, we walked over into the Big Dig and figured out where we might be able to put prairie plants, and in a situation where the plants are not likely to be taken over by a bunch of geese and ducks that are there. And once again, you're talking about a waterway. You're talking about a population of people in Champaign-Urbana that are going to be encouraged by that little experience, which might take them to Arcola or Bloomington. Or Bloomington has a wonderful zoo, for instance. How do we add these places together, and how do we do it is a big question for me. And so one of the things I was talking about this week was the trail from the end of the Kickapoo Trail at the moment. The Kickapoo Trail ends at Main Street, And I find just by talking that there are a lot of people who would like to have an alternate passageway through Champaign. And we've talked about this before, but I think it deserves repetition because not everyone can imagine where we're thinking. So first of all, if we look at this as something that is important to an overall network, it's how to get through Champaign to those places in Piatt County and DeWitt County and Macon County that Champaign-Urbana uses. And that raises the question of Champaign-Urbana using other resources. Do the other resources have to create the infrastructure to make that work? Is that their responsibility? Are they going to get a little piddle money for tourism from Champaign? Or does Champaign deserve to be involved in thinking about putting in a railroad bed that will hopefully bring historic trains into Champaign from Monticello? Once again, I'm back on that, looking at it as broader than just one big dig. We may even want to have a new name for it, a big dig, because it seems to, in the vernacular, develop that name. But there might be something that's a little more elegant than the big dig. But the big dig has prairie in it, and it's preserved, and some of it's very good prairie, right up to University Avenue. So going back to the trail, I'm going to run you through what my evil thoughts are about this trail. First of all, the Forest Preserve owns about half a mile of trackage that's on the west side of the trail. So instead of going through Main Street, which is rather narrow and it has another road coming in and it bends, and not very safe. So we would like to see that trail continue on the old abandoned railroad bed that the Forest Preserve owns for about half a mile. Then there is the pigtail of the yards. There's a big Urbana yard that used to have a roundhouse for steam engines and turntables so that you could turn an engine around and things like that. Well, the Mass Transit Company has their headquarters there now and occupies that space, and it's a fairly large space. The railroad company, when they retire a line, usually keeps a 1 mile track behind the in this case, east of the Norfolk Southern rail yards, so that they can back up a train and then push cars into subsidiary tracks. So the second 400 yards of that pigtail has been decapitated by a road called Smith Road. And that, if we were just to get to buy that 400 yards and go from the Main Street western head of the trail and use the extension of the railroad bed to Smith Road, that would allow you to go with reasonable safety to Weaver Park, where there is a stated headquarters of that trail. The Smith Road doesn't have good side tracks on it, but somehow we could manage to get across that. It's a very short road. It's must be not more than 100 yards. So now, you got to Smith Road. Then you do have active railroad bed. But this is not active in the sense of a train coming through across Lincoln Avenue or in front of Carl Clinic or behind Presence, these two big hospitals. When you put a rail adjacent to a trail, or put a trail adjacent to a rail, rather, you have the possibility of people being on the main line, and you have a lot of fear amongst engine drivers that this is something that will get people killed. Well, it's a very modestly used rail bed, but it still has that sort of fear, and you would have to go into convolutions to get permission to put a rail trail adjacent to a railroad line. And then when you come to places like Lincoln Avenue, you'd have to get across. So the alternative is to go back to Smith Road, and then you go around the north side of the yards. Still would take a lot of negotiation, but at the moment there are roads there that use extra space that's not adjacent to a regularly used railroad line. So, okay, you go as far as MTD. And then MTD has a nice little road around outside of it. You can get into MTD. And MTD has buses that have bicycle carriers on them. So this could be an alternative starting point for going to Danville. Actually, people who come from the Danville area, they don't go to Main Street. They have to go across Route 105 and 150. It's a pretty main intersection near Walmart. So they turn around and go back. They don't even go to Main Street. So so now we go back to Maine. You have a half a mile of forest reserve. Then you have 400 yards of unused railroad bed with rails on it. And buy that piece so that you get into the yards and you get to the MTD building. Well, Cynthia Hoyle is an activist at MTD that's very interested in bicycles and how they get around Champaign and how they connect. So I went to see her, and yes, they're thinking of putting a connection across the extension of the Salt Fork Creek after the boneyard comes in. And they're thinking of putting in a crossing where you push the button and you cross in safety across University Avenue, which is very different from having to go across Lincoln Avenue where there's a train and all sorts of things.
Our discussion on the CU bike list on Facebook has actually been talking about how many different streets we should get these little stops. It's the equivalent of the crossing lights that you see at a stoplight, but these would be specifically for bicyclists and probably for pedestrians, places where there aren't already stoplights. You got 6 minutes. What you would do is you would have, for example, on maybe Clark, where it crosses Lincoln, you'd actually just have a little sign that says this is for, you push the button and it stops the traffic going on Lincoln. There's no stoplight for all the other traffic. It's simply there, put there for pedestrians and bicyclists. So you could have one of those at Prospect somewhere.
These are fairly costly to do, I think.
Certainly, they could be. And also you've got to overcome the momentum or the lack thereof of people saying, no, that would never work. We don't need something like that. Never mind, you can point to other towns that have these. New York City, I believe, has started doing things like this. If not putting in actual traffic signs for bicyclists, they've started allowing bicyclists to cross before the traffic their direction gets to go. In other words, we get about a 10-second head start because we move more slowly across an intersection. This is in New York City. If they can do it, gosh darn it, we've got universities here. We can do the same thing.
Yes, this is very good. Thank you for that comment. So, avoiding some of the main traffic, we would take Cynthia's sort of going across Lincoln, University Avenue at the Ambox Park, through Ambox Park, through the sewage treatment plant at the back of it, and onto a piece of land that is owned by the Urbana Park District on the south side of the Creek as well as on the north side, so you can get into Chief Jamaica Park. I talked to Tim Park about that, and he looked at me, and I knew that he was thinking of the cost of a bridge. They've already thought about it. It's obvious that this is an alternative, and you get onto the road that comes through north of Chief Jamaica Park, and you go west. And you do have to cross, but there are lights on Route 45 going north. It's Cunningham Avenue. You have to, so there's a little bit of traffic there. There's nothing like what you get at Lincoln Avenue. Then you get to Broadway, and you go north on Broadway, and either through Busey Woods or around Busey Woods down to Kohler, and you come back down to Washington, and you take Washington west to behind the Provena, or as it's known now as Presence, and to Martin Luther King Trail, which has interesting connotations of going to an interesting dam there, or you go under the Canadian National at Washington Street, onto Market Street, and then onto the old Wild West Railroad, and you go through to an acreage. It's about an acre and a half of ground that I'm not quite sure about, but might be a future detention pond for water. But it's there between State and Randolph, where the old ice factory was. And so I'm thinking that could be a venue for not only bicycles but other events, and that if we do succeed in getting historic trains into Champaign, then that might be a place where the historic train could park. You need these sorts of things to work. The next step is to take that bicycle trail west, and you can get to Craft, but then you have a bunch of railroads, so you have to go south again and on to Glen, and then to Kaufman Lake Park, and on to another interurban, and through to Seymour. Now, a lot of that corridor is consumed or used for agriculture. So, but we're thinking of that. So please do you think about that. That's the talent of this thing, is to get people thinking together and speaking to each other. They may shout at each other occasionally, but eventually they get some ideas together. So go for it, folks. We need an alternative, low-traffic bicycle way from Oldies and Main Street through to the west side of Champaign. And we appreciate your listening to the diatribe, but think beautiful thoughts. Thanks for listening. This is Dave Monk, your Prairie Monk, WEFT Champaign 90.1 on your FM dial.
And Dave on the board, and as always, the views and opinions expressed are solely those of the speakers and no one else.